Okay, I think we'll make a start. So I'd like to welcome you formally this morning to Mills and Reeve's final termly employment webinar for the education sector for this academic year. I'm Nick Abbott. I'm joined by two of my colleagues this morning, Abisola, Latunji-Cockbill and Sian Jackson. All three of us are senior lawyers in Mills and Reeve's employment team, specialising in work with HE institutions, FE colleges and multi-academy trusts. So for our session this morning, we're going to consider, from a legal perspective, planning for hybrid working arrangements in the education sector. And given the complexity of your institutions, of the varying sizes that you have and the diverse needs of your stakeholders, it's very clear that one size, unfortunately, is not going to fit all. So for this session, we're going to look at four simple questions: why, what, who, and how. There'll be some time towards the end of the session for questions. So if you have any questions, please can you go to the Q&A section. So for most of you, it's going to be a tab at the bottom of your page says Q&A, and please put your questions in there, because that will then help us to see them, marshal them more easily towards the end of the session. In addition, I want to encourage you to use the chat function as well. Again, for most of you, you'll find that at the bottom of the screen. We as speakers will ask you questions and for various feedback as we go, but also the chat, as usual, is a good place to put any comments or observations that you want to make. And if I could ask you, give you an option to click onto the panelists or panelists and attendees. If you can click on the latter so that all your fellow delegates can see the comments you've got to make, that would be great. So our session today will finish at 11, and for those of you who joined us right at the start, you will have seen or heard that the session this morning is being recorded. So to set the scene, let's start briefly with why you might be looking at hybrid arrangements and a more agile workforce before we move on to what that might look like, who it's likely to affect, and how you're going to achieve it. For the moment, how your staff work is still subject to government guidance, with each of the devolved nations on slightly different paths and different timetables. In this morning's session, we're going to primarily look at the near to medium future beyond the current constraints. I anticipate that each of your institutions is going to have a different combination of reasons as to why and to what extent you'll be looking at hybrid arrangements. So my first chat request to you, using the chat at the bottom of the page to panelists and attendees, is can you post in the chat a brief description of the main reasons why your institution is considering some form of hybrid working, or if you're not considering that, we'd really like to see that too. If you're not considering a hybrid at the moment, then perhaps you could just put in the chat the reasons why. So as I say, do please go to chat and let us know why you are considering hybrid working. Given what I would consider to be the constructive and innovative steps which the education sector has taken during the pandemic, this response has certainly proved the maxim that necessity is the mother of invention. But as we shift, hopefully, into more settled times, and having seen the art of what's possible, most of your institutions is going to be taking stock and looking at hybrid, more agile forms of working, rather than a demand that everybody's got to return for all of their working time to campus. And this could be for any number of reasons, and I can see, thank you very much, people are already starting to add those to the chat. But let me give you a few examples that occurs to us. Of course, one of the reasons could be looking at the demands of your students, for universities looking at your research funders, for others looking at employers and other collaborators and stakeholders. The ability to deliver similar outputs in a more collaborative and effective way is also another reason why many of you will be looking at hybrid working. Better utilization or rationalization of your estates. Some of your estates are vast, and this could also be assisted by hybrid working. And of course, responding to individual employee preferences as part of attracting and retaining excellent staff in a competitive world is likely to be another reason why you're looking at hybrid working. Those are just some of the possibilities. Thank you for those of you that have posted some of your reasons why in the chat box. So leaving that, Abisola is now going to consider what hybrid working may look like. Abisola.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm going to dive straight into what it is that we mean when we're talking about hybrid working. And I think it's something that it's important to be quite clear on at the outset in a context setting way, because of course different institutions mean different things when they talk about hybrid working, and certainly different terminology tends to be used when we're talking about hybrid working. So in addition to that terminology, we also see terms being used such as flexible working, remote working, agile working, home working, and atypical working. And we'd be really interested in the chat if there are any other terms that you tend to use at your institution. But following on from that, perhaps more important than what terminology is used to talk about hybrid working is what it is that we mean when we're talking about what comprises hybrid working. And typically speaking, again, there are lots of different options at different institutions, and it's something that you're likely to be deploying at the moment and have been doing for some time. But typically, we're speaking about differences in working location. So traditionally, you may have had the vast majority of your staff working on campus or on the institution's premises, wholly or exclusively. Whereas over the course of the last year or so, we've of course moved to a position where people have been working remotely more often. And even within the context of remote working, that can cover a number of different things. Typically, it covers home working, which again is something which has risen as a result of the pandemic. But we've also seen increases in individual members of staff working remotely from other locations, whether that be abroad or otherwise. And that, of course, brings its own individual considerations. The other area that we tend to look at when we're talking about hybrid working is working hours. And that's something which the sector is fairly used to in the context of annualised hours contracts and term time only contracts, for example. But we also see the introduction and increased use of compressed hours, flexible hours, and job sharing. Now, as I say, it may be that your particular institution has got a set terminology that it uses already when it's talking about hybrid working, and it may be that you've already got various options that you're utilising in terms of what that comprises of. But something that we think is really important in the context of increased discussions around hybrid working is making sure that the institution and its individual employees are on the same page in terms of what it is that we're talking about when we're referring to hybrid working, and indeed the unions, because that will be important to facilitate any discussions going forward. Now, if we're looking at what it is when we're talking about what we mean by hybrid working and what the options may be in terms of what the institution may consider going forward, it's also really important to consider contractual terms. Now, Nick will come on a bit later to look at potential changes to terms and conditions of employment, but right at the outset, we need to be clear on what it is that the institution has in terms of its contractual terms relating to working hours and location, most particularly, before we can consider what hybrid modes of working look like. Now, interestingly, of course, certainly in terms of working location, that's something which has changed a lot over the course of the last year as a result of the pandemic. And therefore, many of your employees will be working at a working location which isn't in accordance with their contract of employment. The same may be true with working hours if adjustments have had to be made for childcare reasons, for example. But we think that it's unlikely that any changes which have come into effect simply as a result of the pandemic and the government guidance, so the urgent need to work remotely, for example, is going to have affected a permanent change to terms and conditions of employment, unless that's something that you've agreed with individual employees, although that's obviously something that would need to be kept under review as and when the government restrictions change. But typically what you're going to be looking at when considering what the current contractual terms are is the written terms and conditions of employment between the institution and its individual employees, and of course any variations to that have been implemented since the contract was entered into, whether that's expressed or implied. The other interesting point which arises in the context of contractual terms is whether, in the context of hybrid working, institutions are going to be looking at permanent changes to contractual terms or something which is more temporary. And I think more typically we would be looking at permanent changes to contractual terms, and it's most often the case, particularly in the context of flexible working, which I'll come on to in a moment, that it is permanent changes to terms and conditions of employment that we tend to look at. But one of the obvious challenges that the pandemic has thrown up, and one of the main considerations that we've seen, is that it's really important for an institution to be able to remain agile and flexible and responsive to any changes when looking at its future working arrangements. That's likely to be part of the reason that you may be considering hybrid working in the first place. So we think that institutions may be slightly slower to seek to implement wholesale and drastic changes on a permanent basis, where those changes don't allow you some flexibility and ability to be responsive to any future changes that may happen. Now, flexible working is one of the alternative terminologies that I referred to for hybrid working, but of course it does have its own legal definition under the statutory flexible working regime, and that's something that you'll all be very used to dealing with in a pre-pandemic context. The reason that I mention it in this context, in determining what it is that we mean by hybrid working, is because in the same way that we've seen an increase in the desire of institutions to look at hybrid modes of working, that has been matched by employees' desire to look at flexible working for them as an individual. And that's therefore led to an increase, or certainly we've seen an increase of flexible working requests, although I'd be very interested in your particular experience in the chat. So in the context of looking at hybrid working, it's important to remind ourselves of what individual employees are able to do if they're seeking more flexibility in their ways of working, and that is to make a flexible working request under the statutory regime, provided that they've got 26 weeks service. And in those circumstances, the institution will need to deal with the request reasonably. It will have 3 months to do so, and it will only be able to reject a request for one of a number of specified reasons. Now, the changes that employees can seek under the flexible working regime relate to a change in hours, a change to the times that they're required to work, and a change to the place of work. So very much along the lines that I've been talking about so far in the context of hybrid working. And traditionally, it's been fairly easy for employers to refuse flexible working requests on one of the specified 8 grounds. So the most commonly used tend to be around the burden of additional cost, detrimental impact on ability to meet customer demand, so student demand, for example, or detrimental impact on quality or performance. But it's also important when considering any increase in flexible working requests for the institution to take stock and make sure that it's familiar with its own flexible working policy, because in our experience that tends to be, or certainly can be, more favourable than the statutory regime. So whilst the penalties, if you like, for failing to comply with the statutory regime don't tend to be significant, so the employer can be required to reconsider the request, or can be ordered to pay up to 8 weeks compensation, which is capped at just over £4,000 in total. As I say, the institution's own flexible working policy may be more favourable than that, and you would therefore need to comply with those terms. So it's a good time when looking at hybrid working to take stock and to consider whether managers on the ground who are operating the flexible working policy are familiar with its contents, it's being operated broadly consistently within the institution, and that there's consideration given as to whether the current flexible working policy is fit for purpose. In the context of many of your fellow sector organisations considering hybrid working, it may be that in order to recruit and retain staff, institutions are going to need to think about whether their current policies are in line with the direction of travel that we're seeing in relation to flexible working more generally. Now, you may be aware that the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy set up a flexible working task force in 2018, which ran for around 18 months or so. But in February this year, Peter Cheese of CIPD was asked to continue his role on that task force and to continue it for a further 18 months to look at it in a more pandemic-specific context. So the task force is currently looking at understanding and supporting the change to hybrid and other ways of working, which were emerging because of the pandemic, and and developing a longer-term understanding of whether there's more to be done to promote ad hoc or non-contractual flexible working. You may also be aware that CIPD is calling on organisations and the government to make the right to request flexible working a day one right. So rather than being something that you have to wait for 26 weeks service for, it's something that CIPD are calling for to be available to employees immediately. And they're really promoting the benefits of flexible working as attraction of talent, improved well-being, engagement and productivity, reduced absenteeism and responsiveness to market change. So again, when looking at the general direction of travel, whilst there's certainly no guarantee that that's what will come through in the legislation, it certainly appears to be the expectation and something which individual employees and institutions are talking about. The task force is also looking at whether the right to apply for flexible working should apply to workers as well as employees, whether temporary changes should be allowed because the statutory scheme generally deals with permanent changes, and changing the assumption to one where requests will be granted rather than one where requests can be refused for one of those 8 reasons. So all of that is to say that in the context of consideration of hybrid working, I think it's important for there to be an eye on what the direction of travel is, and the fact that we're perhaps looking at an increase in expectations around flexible working, which may therefore impact on what options you look at from a hybrid working perspective. And then the final point I'll make before I pass on to Sian is just around objectives. So I think it's fairly easy in the context of the current circumstances to be, or to feel a pressure to come up with quite an immediate plan for hybrid working and what working location and working hours looks like going forward. But it's important also to take a step back and to make sure that any decisions that are made are considered in the context of what the institution is seeking to achieve on a broader level. And in particular, we've seen the need to be fairly responsive to changes as and when they arise. So there will need to be some flexibility built into any arrangements that you've got for hybrid working to make sure that it can align with and follow your overall strategic plan. And I pass you over to Sian.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the who. And so the first point to talk about is what a hybrid role or a blended role or an agile role might look like. And so the current government guidance is still saying that anyone who can work from home should work from home. There are exceptions to that in relation to well-being or other particular reasons why somebody may need to be in the office. And so the earliest this is going to change for England could be the 21st of June, but obviously we won't get a decision looking like until next week as to whether that's stage 4 of the roadmap's going to go ahead or not. So in the meantime, it's important that your organisations follow that guidance. And so looking forward and pending a decision by the government, we know that there was an urgent decision made at the start of the pandemic as to who could work remotely from home and who couldn't. And that was largely by considering what individuals did, their role and the tasks that they had within it. But as we've noted already, it's quite unlikely that what has happened during the pandemic in a crisis time has changed contracts by custom and practice. And importantly, what was justified during that pandemic and necessary at that time might not be the same now. Saying that, it's unlikely that roles or types of work that could not be done remotely or in a more agile way during the pandemic can be done more remotely now. There may be occasions where technology has enabled it or the role has changed. In contrast to that, proper consideration needs to be given for the roles and types of work that could be done remotely during the pandemic, as to whether that is going to continue and what the organisation's position is in relation to it. And so I would, our position is really to recommend that you consider this from 2 perspectives. You've got your institution, the organisation's perspective. And so if we consider this, some organisations, we've seen in the press about Goldman Sachs, who have very strong views in terms of they want everybody to be back to where they were pre-pandemic and back to the office. But it's important to note that this has made headlines because actually most organisations and surveys and BBC and other press reports have indicated that they're looking at a blended model or a hybrid approach, depending on the terminology that you prefer. So that's the organisation's perspective in terms of the general trend that is being shown. And then you've got the employee's perspective. And so from the employee's perspective, the reports have indicated that the majority of employees want to work from home for at least some of the time. And in recent weeks, probably as we've approached towards the 21st of June, there has been more reports of actually people being quite eager to get back to the office or back to campus or wherever their work site is. So it's important to make the decision again and consider that again. So don't rely on what you've done during the pandemic. And so questions that you're considering as an institution are probably some of the following. So you're probably considering what level of online learning you're going to be required to deliver and have decided to deliver online versus in person for the 2021-22 academic year, and why. The types or level of student-facing non-academic roles that may change for the next academic year, and again, why has that changed? And I see in the comments there's a bit about space and capacity. We don't know what the social distancing position would be, but it's certainly made institutions look at their use of space differently and review that. So actually, what will be needed for staff and students, both whilst we have social distancing requirements and also at work and also when they're at home, and why is that needed? And then the level of face-to-face or team working or collaboration that may be needed. So not just face-to-face teaching, but what's required in terms of staff being in the place of work for collaboration purposes, and why, what's the justification for that? And so it'd be interesting in the chat if you can comment on what approach your institution's planning to adopt at the moment, appreciating that there's a lot of discussions happening and that it's not finalised, but it would be good to hear about what your general direction of travel is. So my two tips on considering hybrid roles is, as I said, assess the roles again and continue different ways of working, and then ensure that the current decisions at an institution and also a local level are reasoned, because ultimately this will prove to be justification if it's challenged. And then moving on to the next point, which is need versus preference. So as we all know, the tension arises and the ER teams and specialists get involved if the institution's resource needs don't align with the individual needs or preferences of staff members. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic. And importantly, managers are at the forefront of this. And I note in one of the comments that says that actually staff want hybrid working, but management don't. They want it back to normal. And another saying that their VC prefers campus-based working. So this is where the tension comes. And so in addressing this tension, it's worth breaking it down in terms of need versus preference. And so need, you've got some staff who were allowed to work from home or didn't work at all during the pandemic, whether they were furloughed or because of illness or other reasons. And that meant that their individual circumstances meant that they needed to work from home. And this could have been that they were shielding or they had caring responsibilities. And although some of those reasons may no longer apply, so you're no longer required to shield, there are reasons why certain individuals might still need to continue with those arrangements. For example, the level of pandemic care that happened for children or older adults may not be the same as it was pre-pandemic yet, or even any time in the future. So that's need. And then against that, you've got preference. So individuals over the past few months personally may also have a preference in terms of their future way of working. They may have liked or disliked what they've done in the past few months. More family, more time to exercise, no cost of or time of commute, and they want to continue to have those benefits, and they prefer to have their way of working to continue with those benefits. So the two tips on that are to encourage managers to speak to staff. There's a big piece in terms of upskilling and educating managers on this. And I see there was a reference to managers and leaders needing modern skills in the comments, which I completely agree with, in order to discover and discuss needs and preferences of their teams. And then highlighting and distinguishing between needs and preferences when there is a tension, because often it's needs which are more likely to be related to a protected characteristic. And then the third point is in relation to performance management. And so you know, as HR professionals or in-house employment lawyers, that actually different ways of working require increased levels of trust. And that is perhaps more of an issue with some managers or leadership than others. And so it's important to acknowledge this, and that there are different ways of working may mean there's a culture shift for your institution and particular teams or managers within it. So if you've got an institution which is more at the command and control end of the spectrum, rather than at the employee or autonomy end of the spectrum, or is focused on input rather than output, then it's worth acknowledging that. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but it's worth acknowledging that and being sensitive to that in terms of educating managers and engendering a culture shift if that's required. But ultimately, however, it's important to remember that poor performance isn't going to be remedied by location, and that view does engender a culture of presenteeism, which is not to be encouraged. It is worth noting that there's some figures from ONS which have been reported recently, that actually those who worked from home over a period of years were on an average 38% less likely to have received a bonus compared to those who ever worked from home, and half as likely to be promoted. So it's important to consider when you're considering hybrid working that actually, and the majority of those working flexibly or from home prior to the pandemic were women. This may change in the future, but it's worth considering the disparate impacts, which I'll come on to next. But 2 tips on performance management. It should be addressed with good people management practices as you're familiar with, adapted for remote working as required, and acknowledging the types of employees who are more likely to need to work more flexibly, and educate and consider educate managers about jobs that are designed for inclusion, by focusing on output and contribution rather than actual proximity or social capital that an individual may have by their presence on campus or at your organisation's site. In terms of moving on to disparate impact, this has been widely reported, so I'm not going to rehearse all of the details about the disparate impact of the pandemic, but there are some main key examples. So younger workers have reported about career lockdown and been negatively impacted because they don't have the supervision, the learning by osmosis, and then are more likely to have been furloughed, for example, or be in roles that are more susceptible or likely to have been furloughed. There's been reports of women having a pandemic penalty, so they're less likely to have had the research hours because they've had responsibility for childcare. And so secondly, it's important to consider that was the disparate impact during the pandemic, but also what on coming out of the pandemic and the disparate impact and the reasons for people being reluctant to perhaps return to the place of work, and that might be because of protected characteristic. So a requirement to work for campus, or even an encouragement to work to campus, may be discriminatory, and so that's important to consider. And the other point is about the 2-tier workforce, and so you could, when considering the roles and roles that lend themselves to working remotely or having a hybrid model compared to those who don't, you may have those roles that are working on campus, which are cleaners, security, and perhaps lower skilled roles, and those that are more professional or academic roles working remotely or having the benefits of a more hybrid model, creating a 2-tier workforce. And so it's important to consider flexibility around that and actually ensuring that the impact is considered. And I noticed that in one of the comments, it was said that there was an opportunity to harmonise work practices, because particularly in universities, there's been a 2-tier workforce in terms of academic and professional services. And actually, if there's an opportunity, that could be a positive in terms of harmonising and working practices between academics and professional services. But at the same time, being conscious that you're not also creating a 2-tier workforce in other respects in relation to lower skilled or more professionally skilled workers. So tips for that in terms of doing it, I would recommend doing an equality impact assessment, And importantly, implementing the changes that are identified to mitigate any disparate impacts and keeping that under review. And consider the employee's circumstances both now and coming out of the pandemic when applying principles or policies. That could be promotion criteria, performance, etc., to make sure that that impact is mitigated. I'm now going to hand over to Nick, and he's going to talk about how to implement agile or hybrid working.
Okay, thanks very much, Sian, and thank you for people that are posting in the chat, and also for the people that have posed questions. As I've said in the chat, it's been drawn to our attention that the questions are people can see those. So if anybody's got concerns, there is certainly in the Q&A function an opportunity to anonymize the question when you pose it, so that you can't be identified. So as Sian says, we've looked at the why, the what, and the who you may be considering for hybrid working. Now we're going to move on to what perhaps is the biggest challenge, which is how you're going to implement that change. And as HR professionals, as many of you will be, you're going to be experts when it comes to change management. So we're going to concentrate. I'm going to concentrate on in this section on key issues from a sort of a structural and legal perspective. So, as with any potential change to working terms or conditions, the golden thread is going to be consultation with your staff. No rocket science there. You want to be using your usual methods for consultation with staff representatives. But as I'm sure most of you already done, it's going to be useful to engage directly with your staff, and potentially by using a staff survey to collate views, engage opinions. And I'm sure many of your institutions will have done that already. Then, as you start to compile a picture of your institution's needs and the view of your staff and their representatives, you then need to move on to the next sort of stage up in my thinking, which is to review your staff policies to assess whether they are fit for purpose in this new hybrid working world. And it's likely that you're going to need to update a number of those policies. Abisola has already mentioned flexible working, which you may need to look at. How about having a home working policy? You may not have one. You may decide that that's really what you need, as a greater proportion of your workforce spend more time working from home flexibly. Maybe you need even to have a new hybrid working policy. What about health and safety? Does your health and safety policy extend sufficiently far to cope with these new locations of working? And what about data protection, data management? Conscious now that flows of information will be flowing much more. It won't necessarily be contained on campus anymore. It will be from different work locations and potentially on different IT equipment. So really one needs to go back to policies to check that they are fit for purpose. So you start to assess your institutional needs. You've started to consult with your staff and look at your policies. You're then going to need to critically analyze what changes to terms and conditions you're going to need to make. And from a practical perspective, what you're going to want to do is to sort of take the path of least resistance and steer as closely as you can to the status quo. And so at one end of the spectrum, one of the things we have got that's on the slide there under C is a temporary change to terms and conditions. It may be that for some institutions, what you want to achieve in the sort of the medium and short term is that you want to avoid engaging in the big wheels of extensive organisational change, perhaps because you're fearful of what changes the government is still yet to make, or where the pandemic will go. And for all institutions, we've all been operating, all employers have been operating some form of temporary change implemented through local management, and you can continue to do that. You can continue at a local level to adapt existing contracts on a temporary basis, returning to the substantive contracts as you need. But although this has the advantage of giving you the opportunity to be more nimble-footed in the face of new and fast change, it does, of course, bring with it disadvantages, the primarily one being continued uncertainty for staff, and also whether you're going to be able to deliver sufficiently to the demands of your students and your stakeholders, and the risk of disparity across the institution at local level as to what temporary change will mean. It would need to be properly managed, and you need to be careful that temporary change doesn't turn into something more permanent. So let's say then that for particular groups within your institution, you do reach a point at which you want to make some more permanent changes. You're going to need to consider how significant those changes are compared with the existing terms and conditions of employment that you have with your staff. For permanent changes of any substance, it's unlikely that you're going to have the power under the existing contract to make that change unilaterally, but it's still worth checking the extent to which your existing contracts do give you some flexibility, which may allow some lesser level policy change. But if, for example, you're seeking changes, as we've already discussed, as Abisola and Sian have mentioned, you're looking at changes to the place of work, or you're looking perhaps to the change of hours and work pattern, well, then that is going to more likely need a permanent change, which will necessitate agreement with the staff to whom those changes are applicable. And it's likely that in order to effect those changes, you're going to need to engage your collective bargaining mechanism with recognised trade unions. And hopefully what you'll be able to aim for with that collective bargaining is to address and formulate an overall framework for terms and conditions, which you can then move to the individual level to agree individually those changes with individual employees. When you do reach that stage of individual agreement, again, what you're going to be looking for is the simplest method of achieving the agreement. And it might be that what you can do is to have a range of options for changes for employees to voluntarily opt into. Alternatively, Abisola has mentioned the statutory mechanism of flexible working request, and you might be able to extend your flexible working policy to provide broader opportunities where flexible working can be requested and agreed without a significant process having to be gone through. And although you want to sort of avoid the sort of nuclear option, if you like, ultimately, yes, you can force changes to terms and conditions of employment by giving notice to terminate the existing contract and then offering immediately the new terms that you want to put forward. But you'll appreciate that this sort of fire and rehire is very much the last resort, and in an environment in which you're seeking to get the benefits of efficiencies and flexible working for staff, it sort of sits uncomfortably alongside a more collaborative approach to change management. In any event, firing and rehiring, you'll need to be mindful of three key legal points. The first is that the termination, the bringing the existing employment to an end before you offer the new terms, that's going to be a dismissal and all the statutory rights that come with that. If the number of those at risk of having their employment terminated goes above the usual thresholds, then you're going to be triggering your collective consultation obligations as you would for redundancy consultation. And in addition to the almost certain adverse impact on industrial relations, you also need to be mindful that in certain circumstances there's statutory protection afforded, which means that you as an employer can't offer terms individually to staff which you haven't been able to agree with recognised trade unions. So there's some nasty traps and pitfalls there beyond the inevitable difficulties which firing and rehiring are going to cause in terms of industrial relations. And that brings me on to the penultimate point on the slide, which is looking at managing industrial relations generally, because of course that's going to be an important factor for any implementation of changes to terms and move towards a more hybrid working. Any structural changes, I guess, is going to come with some risk of industrial unrest. I mentioned at the start the golden thread of consultation, and I think that's going to be equally important here in managing industrial relations. And from my perspective as an employment lawyer, really, I tend to look at this as there being four main elements to managing industrial relations: assessment, consultation, strategy, and communication. And I'll look at each of those four just briefly. So for assessment, what you're going to be looking at is the needs of your institution, of your students, of your research and employer collaborators and other stakeholders. And an additional part of the assessment, as Sian has mentioned, is your public sector equality duties, which the vast majority of you are going to have, which for changing to working practices is almost certainly going to centre on assessing the potential impact of the proposed changes on those with protected characteristics. So you're going to need to make an assessment to help manage industrial relations. The next thing is consultation. You'll necessarily be consulting with staff. And of course, it'd be good practice, short of specific requirements, to do so under your collective bargaining mechanism to engage with your trade unions in any event. The third element that I look at is strategy, particularly in relation to any more significant change projects. It's useful to be sort of preparing a proposed strategy or a business case, drawing in the consultation, any staff surveys, the results of those that you've had, and then converting that into some form of proposal, something which you may then be able to look at as forming the basis of piloting or testing working methodologies, which will undoubtedly help you to engage with staff and develop workable solutions. Communication is the fourth element, and one which underpins the other three, namely communication which is two-way, which engages with staff, which reflects the culture of your institution, and which is clear and consistent. So 4 ways of managing industrial relations: assessment, consultation, strategy, communication. And then the final point I want to make is in relation to how you will implement a new form of hybrid working, and a reminder not to lose sight of local level implementation. It's one thing for you and your institutions to consider centrally what you're planning to do, to consult and to make proposals, but ultimately these changes are going to need to be implemented and managed at a local level. So you therefore are going to need to ensure that you're developing and equipping line managers appropriately, and as Sian highlighted, that was something that came out in the chat, the concept that you're going to need to have line managers who are adapted to these new forms of working, so that with professional support from you in HR, the managers can progress, implement and actively manage new working methodologies, and do so consistently, mindful of your culture and equality issues. Well, that concludes our canter through some of the main legal issues you are likely to face when planning for hybrid working. I can see that a number of questions have come into the chat. So for the last part of our session this morning, we're going to address some of those. I'm going to ask my colleagues to unmute themselves and whether there were any that they wanted to pick up to start with. Sian or Abisola, are there any that you would like to pick up?
There's one about staff who resort to sickness absence, citing anxiety and stress of returning to campus, which we had kind of during the pandemic, didn't we? In the easing of lockdown that we had. And the question is, should this be managed differently or in a similar way that the COVID-related absences have been recorded and managed? If occupational health say that there are issues to be resolved, if management would give consideration to flexible home working, how much weight does the occupational health recommendation have if staff are told to return? And so I think in terms of the first question, management of it, yes, treat it as you would any other absence, and seek occupational health advice as to as to the anxiety and stress, what's causing it, whether there are any recommended arrangements that which would enable the person to return to work, given that that's what you're requiring. And then in the second question, if occupational health said, yes, there are working arrangements or reasonable adjustments, if it is a disability in their view, which you could do, and that happens to be flexible working or working from home, which you've said the role isn't able to do, then it's a question as with any other occupational health recommendation. You have to consider what's reasonable for the organisation and the need of that role. Again, it comes back to your justification as to why the role is required to work on site and it can't be at home, and why therefore the recommendation can't be implemented because it's not reasonable. So that's ultimately your decision as a manager and the organisation's need, but it's being aware that obviously that could be challenged, and if ultimately the anxiety does constitute a disability and a claim's brought, then you'll need to justify not implementing the reasonable adjustment if the duty to make reasonable adjustment arises. So I would treat in the same way as you would any other absence in terms of the recommendations against the need, and justifying it, and use your best practice in relation to that.
Thank you, Sian. Abisola, is there any questions there that caught your attention?
Yeah, so there's an interesting question. So it says, if individuals refuse to return to the physical campus because they've proven that they've been able to do their job remotely, is the disciplinary procedure appropriate, i.e. breach of contract, failure to follow a reasonable management instruction? And I think it's a really interesting one, because if we look at it from a kind of non-pandemic context, ordinarily in circumstances where an employee is required to work on campus and they suddenly decide that they're going to work from home because they can do so perfectly legitimately, then I think that in those circumstances you'd fairly quickly be resorting to a disciplinary procedure. Or certainly you'd be dealing with it as a reasonable instruction to work from campus, and then if they continue to refuse, then look at it potentially as a disciplinary matter. I think that the same is true when we're looking at it in a pandemic context, with the obvious difference being that, as you say in the question, the employee's perspective is that they've proven that they've been able to work from home. So I think the key difference there is the institution being able to reason and evidence why it is important for, notwithstanding the fact that that employee may have worked perfectly well from home for the past year or more, why it is at this point considered important that they return to campus. And that may be fairly obvious, and it may, very much depend on the nature of the role, the need to recommence face-to-face teaching, for example. But I think it's, so ultimately, I think it is something that would ultimately deal with as a failure to follow a reasonable management instruction. But I think that there is also an important part in being able to show the rationale and the reasoning behind the requirement for that employee to be on campus, exploring any particular reasons for their refusal to come back. So it may just be I prefer working from home, so that's what I'm going to do. There may be Equality Act considerations, for example, if it relates to a concern about safety on campus relating to a disability. But again, that I anticipate that would be a process of seeking to reassure the employee about the measures that are in place, and ultimately considering whether in that particular instance it is reasonable to require the employee to work on site. And if so, I think ultimately it may be something that you do deal with as a disciplinary matter, but also having an eye to what else is, or how else similar matters are being dealt with in the institution to ensure that there's some consistency as well.
Okay, thank you, Abisola, and some good and helpful comments coming in on the chat as well. Some good questions here. The one that caught my eye, which isn't a million miles away from the one that Abisola just replied to, but comes on to one of the points that I made, which was a question which says, if there's a decision to dismiss and re-engage and then a dismiss due to SOSR, how obligated is the business to create or find a role that suits the employee's preferred way of working? So this is a comment, or a question rather, that relates back to my sort of nuclear option that I mentioned, the concept of firing and rehiring. I really should stop repeating that phrase because I'm not sure that I like it particularly, and I'm just coining what media is referring to at the moment. But joking aside, it's actually quite interesting because it's something that the government asked ACAS to look at, and ACAS reported back to the government, and we were half expecting there to be something in the Queen's speech, but as you will appreciate, there wasn't. But to answer the question, yes, if we reach a point as an institution where you feel you've got no alternative but to say, look, we've consulted with you, these are the terms that we think it is reasonable for you to move on to. We're going to give you notice under your existing terms and then offer to re-engage you on these new terms immediately afterwards. Yeah, if they don't accept those terms, then your termination of their current existing employment does indeed amount to a dismissal. As the questioner rightly observed, if you were going to have to defend a claim in the employment tribunal because the person's got sufficient continuity, then the argument is likely to be that the dismissal is for SOSR for some other substantial reason. But the nub of the question is around, okay, well then how much do we have to do as an employer to create or find a role that suits the employee's preferred way of working? My answer to that is that you've got to go to a certain extent to do that as part of justifying you pushing the button on the last resort, which is terminating their employment because they won't agree to the terms. So you're going to need to have already justified to yourselves why it's important for them to work in the particular way that you want them to work and the changes that you're making. And lots of you have put in the chat about this tension between what you want to be able to give to your staffs flexibly and what the needs of the institution are. Sian talked about the needs versus preference conflict, but ultimately it is about justifying and looking at what the outputs of the institution are and what you structurally need to do in order to be able to achieve that. So I think you're not obligated to find them a new role or create one that suits the individual employee, but you are going to need to have thought about and consulted with them before you terminate their employment under the existing terms as to why the existing terms are no longer possible or what they want isn't there. And yes, of course, you're going to need to look for alternative employment as you would for any other SOSR dismissal, but that's more around existing vacancies rather than changing or agreeing terms that the employee is demanding that he or she should receive. So thank you for those questions. Abisola, Sian, are there are some other ones that we haven't answered? Is there any there that
which I'm going to cheekily because I'm also interested, though we've had some conversation with clients, but the first question we had was about compensatory payments for home working and considerations about that and what other HEIs are doing. So if any of the other attendees want to put in comments what their thoughts are in relation to their institution about compensatory payments for home working, then I'm sure that the questioner will be interested, as will we. But I'm going to touch on that and link it, hopefully, with the question below. But we've had quite a lot of discussions with clients about compensation for equipment, and then internally and separately occasionally with clients, we've had discussions about actually should there be some incentive or benefit linked. Should actually people who are working from home have less holiday, and should terms be adjusted accordingly, which is an interesting concept. And we haven't, I don't know whether Abisola or Nick have spoken to clients, but yet we haven't, we're not aware of clients that are proposing to have different reward structures depending on whether somebody is remote working or not. But in terms of equipment, then there's no legal obligation for you to provide equipment, whether you choose to do so from a employer of choice, as a lot of you have said in the comments, perspective is a different matter. But there's no legal obligation other than health and safety or in the context of reasonable adjustments to provide equipment. But in terms of compensation and broadband, then that's when it gets a bit grey in terms of what you want to do as an employer of choice, which is how I'm going to link it to the next question about actually the two-tier workforce and the impact. And actually some roles, you're right, you can't do cleaning from home. You can't secure a building or provide security from a building from home. And so there's going to be two-tier workforce, and actually we know that there are more ethnic minority staff and women in those lower skilled roles, and therefore there is going to be a disparate impact on those with those characteristics. And so that then it's going to, okay, ultimately you could seek to objectively justify it because it's the requirement of the role of being a cleaner. But before you get to that stage, and before hopefully you have a legal challenge, well, how are you making people want to come back to work? How are you making the environment different? That doesn't have to be compensation, but it might be that actually people want to come and see their colleagues, they want to collaborate. And so there's a practical element about what you're offering in terms of compensation for home working or equipment for home working, and what you're offering to staff for, that are on campus, aligning with what the organisation needs are, before you get to the legal consideration, which would have to resort to objective justification if there was a disparate impact. But obviously, although there's more women in lower skilled roles, it might be that actually it evens out overall, because you've got more women in professional roles that are able to work remotely, and it suits their childcare arrangements. So it was worth keeping an eye on the stats, keep doing quality impact assessments to measure how many are working remotely, so that you can mitigate it. But ultimately, think of ways that you want to incentivize individuals to do, or encourage individuals to do what the organisation needs.
Thank you, Sian. I've had there are various sort of comments in the chat about, I think some people are able to see some of the chat, not all of the chat. Some people are able to see some of the Q&A, not all of the Q&A. We've been conscious, certainly in terms of the Q&A, to try and repeat the questions just so that everybody can hear those. Just on that point, and I'm sure Michelle Wenham will not mind, as she revealed herself, to say that she has been, she's got some various training for managers that she's looking at on skills to help them to manage remotely, but she's sort of, and I'm extending on her behalf a plea to anybody, for Michelle Wenham, of any great recommendations about training for managers for remote working. And the reason I'm endorsing that sharing is because as it comes back to one of the points I made, which is about empowering local managers. I think that's going to be one of the biggest shifts, is the responsibility at that local level to deal day to day with how hybrid working is going to work. The one final point that I will make, and although I hope you don't mind that we're sort of dodging it slightly, but there's a question about what about working from outside the UK? Well, there's a seminar in itself there. And joking aside, we've got some briefing sheets on Mills and Reeve's website in relation to that, because we've been asked that question a lot in relation to education institutions, and particularly universities, where they find that many of their lecturers have sort of gone home to their home countries and are providing work from there. And there are a lot of difficulties with that, not least you're starting to look at 2 sets of laws, 2 sets of social security, 2 sets of tax, and so that needs some careful consideration to sustain. But I point you to our briefing. I'm conscious that time is running out, and I said that we would bring this to a close at 11 o'clock, so that is what I'm going to do. As I say, as well on our website, as well as briefings on working from abroad, there's all of our employment and education seminars are posted on Mills and Reeve's website. They're easily accessible and seen under the events tab. And indeed, it's not too late to sign up tomorrow if you're an in-house lawyer watching this, because there's the next in our series of In Focus sessions for in-house lawyers. It's going to look at data protection. So please do attend that if you're able to do so. We put on the slide here all of our contact details. If there are any follow-up questions that you've got, then obviously please feel free to contact any one or all 3 of us. When you leave this session this morning, you'll be asked for a quick feedback. It would be great if you were able to do that for us. We really do value your feedback, and we act on what it is. Other than that, it just remains for me to thank you on behalf of Sian, Abisola, myself, for attending this morning, for your great contribution in the chat and the questions that you have asked. We hope that you found it interesting, and we look forward to seeing you at another one of our sessions in the future. But in the meantime, good morning and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.